Good day everyone, welcome to Any One-on-One. Today we've got the 28th Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Tony Abbott AC, once again on the podcast program. Welcome, Tony.
Andy, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on the show. Tony, I guess we'll talk a little bit about the Voice Referendum, which is obviously due to occur on the 14th of October. What is your stance on the Voice and how will this impact the Indigenous Australians in our country?
Well, Andy, thanks for asking me that question. This is an extremely important event. It's much more important than an election because you can change a bad government, you can change bad laws, but if you make a mistake in the Constitution, you're stuck with it forever. So this is really important, and I think it's a terrible mistake, a terrible mistake. The Voice, it's wrong in principle, it would be bad in practice, it would entrench race in our Constitution, it would reinforce the separatism that is at the heart of Indigenous disadvantage, and it would gum up our system of government even more. So I don't think it will be good for Aboriginal people, and it certainly won't be good for the general Australian population, because if it gets through, it will essentially say there are two classes of people in this country. There are those whose ancestors turned up, or at least some of them turned up tens of thousands of years ago, and there's everyone else who's come since 1788. And I think it's particularly problematic for recent migrants because the whole ethos of this country up till now has been you can come here from anywhere, from any country, any culture, any race, any religion. You can come here from anywhere, join Team Australia and be a first-class Australian citizen.
That's right.
And this is basically saying, well, actually, no, it's not like that at all. If you want to be a really first-class Australian, your ancestry's got to go back beyond 1788.
Well, if the issue is closing the gap within the Indigenous community, and obviously Albanese is pushing very hard to get this through, it doesn't really explain how this is going to play out and how it would actually benefit those in the Aboriginal community. So, you know, why is he doing this at a time where, you know, cost of living are going up?
Well, 2 points, Andy. First of all, he doesn't want to explain because he doesn't want to tell us the details. Because if he were to give us the details, either he would upset the activists who are pushing this, or he would gravely alarm the citizenry who don't want to see more bureaucracy, don't want to see more separatism, don't want to see more spending. So that's the first point. The second point is, this is not going to help Aboriginal people. We have a superabundance of advice already. There are 11 individual Indigenous voices in the Parliament right now. We've got the National Indigenous Australians Agency spending something like $4.5 billion, this agency alone, every year. And part of its remit, a very important part of its remit, is to represent Indigenous people at all levels of government. You had the Productivity Commission report of 2017, which not only said that the general government spending on Aboriginal people is roughly double the general government spending on the rest of us, but it also said that there's something like 100 separate agencies and entities already representing Aboriginal people. So this Voice is going to double down on failure. It's going to be a reinforcement and an entrenching of this separatism which has bedeviled Aboriginal policy ever since Gough Whitlam's day. It's no wonder, because if you say to people, you're different, you're special, the rules governing you shouldn't be the same as the rules governing everyone else. Our expectations of you are different from the expectations that we have of everyone else. Is it any wonder that we get the results that we've got?
So what are the members of the Aboriginal community saying to the Voice?
Well, Indigenous Australians are divided on this, just as the general community is divided on this. I should point out that Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine have been absolutely heroic in their leadership here. two proud Indigenous people
Yep.
who have been prepared to stand against the noisy activists who have, for too long, I think, had too much of a say, or certainly a disproportionate say, on Indigenous matters. But as far as we can tell, and I'm relying on polling that was done a couple of months back for an organisation called Message Stick, which is a pro-voice entity. But the Message Stick polling said that amongst Aboriginal people it was 30% yes, 25% no, and 45% don't know. So it's something like 70%, at least a couple of months back, that were either no or don't know, and that's amongst Aboriginal people themselves.
From a cultural perspective, how would the Voice Referendum impact on other ethnicities, including the Chinese community?
Well, the big problem is, why should just one group have their own special voice? We don't give migrants a constitutionally entrenched voice. We don't give old people or young people or disabled people a constitutionally entrenched voice. So why should we give Indigenous people a constitutionally entrenched voice? Now, I accept that it is important to acknowledge that Aboriginal people were here first, and it's important that we give them the respect that they deserve.
That's right.
And that we acknowledge the ongoing cultures, etc. But there's a world of difference between simple recognition and acknowledgement and the voice, which is all about power. So every Australian would be somewhat disempowered if a small group of Australians, under 4%, according to the current census, are given more power. I mean, more power for some invariably means less power for others. And in any event, the whole thing offends against the principle of constitutional equality, which should be at the heart of our system.
That's right. Well, Tony, what are the polls saying at the moment? Because I've seen a pretty consistent trend of decline in support of the yes.
I've always said, don't worry too much about the polls. Look at the reality. And as I said, my argument is that this thing is wrong in principle and bad in practice. Regardless of what the polls say, it would still be a terrible idea. But for what it's worth, it does seem, looking at the polls, that the more people look at this, the less they like it. For instance, back in February, News Poll had 60% support for the voice. Today, the latest News Poll has support for the voice down to 36%. But I don't think anyone who wants to keep our constitution colourblind can be complacent, because there's still almost 3 weeks to go. There's a massive wave of pro-voice advertising and pro-voice propaganda from the government. There's a lot of moral intimidation and bullying going on. There was a case, I gather, I read about it in the papers over the weekend, of a professor from the ANU who's a yes supporter actually spitting on a no supporter. That's the level of nastiness that seems to be creeping into this debate. And I fear that a lot of no voters won't turn up and vote, because they don't want to be bullied at the polling booths. But the point I make, please, to every Australian, please, if you want to keep our constitution colourblind, you've got to go to the polling booths and vote. I think it is your duty as a citizen to go to the polling booths and vote no to keep our constitution colourblind.
That is important. Tony, government spend around $30 billion a year on addressing Indigenous issues, but we haven't been able to close the gap or achieve the outcome that we desire. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's actually more like $40 billion if you take the totality of government spending on Indigenous people. That's based on a productivity report, Productivity Commission report from 2017, adjusted for inflation. Why has all this spending not made a difference? Well, I think the fundamental problem is that the spending is designed to reinforce separatism as opposed to help integration. The goal of policy back up until the mid-1970s was to integrate Aboriginal people into the wider Australian community, and that's a perfectly sensible goal. Every migrant community knows that its task, if you like, is to be integrated into the wider Australian community, to speak English, to get jobs, to make a home, to be part of Team Australia. And that was the goal with Aboriginal people, the official goal with Aboriginal people. Now, it's still the goal of most Aboriginal people, I think, but the official objective is self-determination, which in practice means separatism. And so much of the spending is directed to people in very remote communities. Now, the difficulty for these very remote communities is that most of them have no economic base. And if you've got no economic base, there tends to be idleness, dysfunction, substance abuse, and the end result is that the adults don't go to work, the kids don't go to school, there's a lot of disorder, which in many cases the police aren't able or aren't willing to properly sort out. Over time, what has to happen is that people living in these remote places without a firm economic base need to be empowered to have a real choice to leave if they want. And at the moment, that is often not the case, regrettably.
So what do you suggest to be the better alternative or solution to the issue if it wasn't the voice?
Well, my version of constitutional recognition would be to place some extra words in the preamble after one indivisible federal commonwealth, to put in these words: with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character. Because it's true that we do have an Indigenous heritage, it's true that we did have a British foundation, it's true that we do have an immigrant character. And the great thing about that is that it acknowledges all of the major contributions to modern Australia. And there's something in it for everyone. Whether your ancestors were here tens of thousands of years ago, whether you came on the first or second fleet, or whether you've come more recently, there's something in it for everyone. And I think it would actually be a pretty good shorthand description of Australia.
I agree.
What's Australia? It's a country with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character. And all three of those features have helped to make us the wonderful, wonderful place that we are.
Absolutely, Tony. Very well said. Now, moving forward, if the voice doesn't pass through, what implications would this have for the Albanese government?
Okay, well, I would like people to vote on the merits of this. I can understand people liking or disliking the Albanese government, as the case may be, but I want decent Labor people to vote on the merits. I don't want them to feel compelled by party politics to vote one way or the other. That said, the Prime Minister has made it his signature project. He has basically told us that he wants this to be his chief legacy. So it will be a difficulty for him. But again, I don't want people to focus on whether this is going to be good or bad for the Prime Minister or good or bad for the opposition leader. I want them to focus on our country. Is this going to be good or bad for our country? And I think, as I've explained, it's going to be most unfortunate for our country. It would be a false step, in my view. It would contradict everything that we've tried to be up till now as a nation, were we to go down this path.
What are your views on the upcoming federal election and Peter Dutton as leader of the coalition party?
Okay, well, again, I want to stress that as a former Liberal Prime Minister, I obviously am a barracker for Peter Dutton, and in that sense, I want him to succeed and his opponents not to. But I don't want people to mix these issues up. I want decent, honest Labor people to think, what sort of an Australia do they really want? Do they want an Australia where your weight in the system is at least partly determined by ancestry, or do they want to maintain the wonderful constitutional equality that we've had? All of that said, I think Peter Dutton is a terrific bloke. I've known him for years. I served with him in the Howard government. He was obviously a senior member of my government. I think that unlike a lot of politicians, because he was first of all a copper with the Queensland Police Force, and after that he ran a series of small businesses before coming into Parliament. He's got a wonderful family. I think he's, by comparison to a lot of politicians who've lived their whole life in the Canberra bubble, I think he's very well grounded. And if he does get the support of the people at the next election, I think he'll make a wonderful Prime Minister.
Thanks, Tony, for your time today.
Good on you,
for your
Andy.
contributions.
Thank you.
Cheers, mate.